As we look at the churches of Asia, or listen to the churches of Asia, I just decided during lunch, after I graded my papers, I got them done hours in advance. You have 2 weeks, and I've got them done at least 3 hours before they were due. So I had an extra 5 minutes. And I decided to look over my notes and decided to start with China. I think that most of us China has always been the darling of the West. For some reason or another, more people are interested in business even today. More missionaries wanted to go to China. If they couldn't go to China, then Japan. If they couldn't go to China or Japan, then Korea. And if they couldn't go to China, Japan, or Korea, well, India. And if they couldn't get there, then they would go to Africa. And that is literally the truth. China was always the goal. For some reason or another, I don't know if it's Confucius or whatever, but I think it's the ancient civilization there that goes back to maybe the earliest humanoids, in the Yangtze River Valley. Who knows? So anyway, I thought you might be interested in China, and I will begin with a true story related to my daughter, or our daughter, who was teaching English in China in a beautiful town of Yuncheng, just a small little village of 1 million people, known for vinegar and salt flats, and also a soap factory. So that's what it was known for. So we went out to eat one night, and they have so much vinegar in their food, and it was a very hot restaurant, and my wife and I are here with our daughter, and all these Chinese are so happy that this American professor came. And my wife just threw up all over everything because it was hot, and you have vinegar, and it was just, it wasn't really, it was the only place in China that the food wasn't good. So that's where our daughter lived, and she tells this story about when she was teaching English. She attended a local church, and they just embraced her. They had never had a Westerner in their church, and she was teaching English there. So they took care of her. They found out she played flute, so she got to play flute for a Christmas special that they had that we have on videotape that is really quite entertaining in ways that it wasn't meant to be. And a member of the church invited her over for tea. And she thought she knew how to get there, but then she realized these alleyways, it's really hard to figure out when one street starts and another one ends. So she asked one of her students, who she gave the name Jeffrey, if Jeffrey could lead her to the house. So they're walking around these little side streets and the walls, and they finally see it there, and so they knock on the door. And the lady comes to the gate and says, "Oh, Caroline," and then looks at Jeffrey and says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm just one of her students, and I just brought her here." So that was the first question, "Who are you?" The second question, "Are you a Christian?" "No, ma'am, I'm not." "Oh, then come on in." You see, if he'd been a Christian, okay, that's all right, you can leave. But he wasn't. And so she saw it as an opportunity. God had brought somebody to her gate. She went in and gave her testimony, talked to this young man about what it meant to be a Christian, and it wasn't all health and wealth gospel. When she came to faith during the Cultural Revolution, her husband beat her and then finally kicked her out of the house, and she had to take the 2 children, find a place to live. It would have been a lot easier not to be a Christian, okay? So that was the testimony that she gave to him. Therefore, don't you want to follow Jesus? It was the real story. That was her testimony. And I'll fast forward later at the end of my lecture about Jeffrey. If I forget, please ask me. This is fairly typical of Chinese Christians. Their lives have been changed, they're excited about it, and they can't not talk about it. Any opportunity they have, they're looking for some way of expressing and linking with other people who do not know the name of Christ. Let me back up and give a little bit of history of what's happened in the People's Republic of China. First, whatever you hear about Christianity in China is true somewhere. But nothing you hear about Christianity in China is true everywhere. So if somebody says, "Oh, isn't there persecution in China? Are the Christians persecuted?" Well, yeah. Yeah, but I understand there's great freedom, and the government is actually building churches for Christians. Yeah, I've been in 2 of them. Yeah, the government is actually building churches for Christians, okay? So anything you hear is true somewhere. And so you have to kind of weigh these things and say, what is the general impression? What is actually going on? And I do not have the final answer. I'm just making it possible for you to be suspicious even about what I say. Christianity came to China 5 times. Did you know that? First time was in 635 by Persian Christians who were wandering peripatetic missionaries, and they just kept going east. Christianity spread out from Jerusalem everywhere, and they made it probably to Korea and possibly Japan. Pure Land Buddhism, which comes from Japan, according to a Buddhist professor here at the University of Pittsburgh, and this has been written about quite a bit, was influenced. The Pure Land idea is the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. And so probably Christianity in the 7th and 8th century had an influence on Buddhism in Japan. So that was the first round. But what happens in most countries in Asia, there's an openness to new ideas and then close, an openness and close. And that's happened a number of times in China. And when it closes, it usually is a new regime that comes to power, a new dynasty. And the new dynasty wants to protect their culture and keep out other people. Have you heard of the Great Wall? That's an extreme example of keeping out new ideas or foreign people. But the last time, the 5th time Christianity came to China, it wasn't coming in from the outside, it was bubbling up from within. And it never would have bubbled up from within had it not had those other 4 sort of layers of coming. First from the Syrians, or the Persians, and then secondly from Franciscans coming from Western Europe, and then thirdly Roman Catholics beginning in the 16th century, and then finally Protestants beginning in 1807. But it was the last one, the 5th one, that has just turned the world upside down. So a little history will help. In 2007, I was at the Baptist University of Hong Kong, a very good university, giving one of the many, many lectures. I was not that special. They had, I don't know, tens of, maybe 100 different lectures, because they were celebrating, Chinese were celebrating a Westerner. And it wasn't Marx or Engels. Chinese were celebrating a Scotsman, a Presbyterian, Robert Morrison. He was a great scholar who began the work in China in 1807, and he was developed into a great linguist. He began studying Chinese while he was in the UK from the Jesuits who had gone before. And so he was learning from the Jesuits. So there's a connection with the Roman Catholics and the early Protestants coming to China. So they were just real excited about this, and it's amazing because many scholars from mainland China, most of them, maybe all of them, not explicit Christians. Not explicit Christians. They may have been culture Christians, but not one of them was within the China Christian Council, the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. These were university professors from Beijing, from Wuhan, from the Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing and Shanghai, and they are excited about studying Christianity. So one of them came to me and said, did you know that all the words that we have for physics terms and chemistry terms and mathematics were developed by Christian missionaries? He's asking me that. And I said, well, yes. As a matter of fact, most of them were first developed by Calvin Wilson Mateer, who graduated from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. It's true. That's why I wanted to put it in this lecture. The contribution of missionaries to the development of China is just inestimable. All of modern math, all of modern chemistry, all of modern physics, all of modern educational theory, sociology, was first introduced by missionaries. And you were not allowed to talk about that until about 1985 or 89, when they began publishing Bibles in China, when they allowed that. But now the Chinese scholars are fascinated. They can't believe all these connections. And so now the Chinese government is studying Christianity to say, why is it that with Christianity came hospitals, higher education, modern science, all the things that now make China work? And so they're fascinated to study that. It was an amazing conference. So the contribution of missionaries has been inestimable. Many missionaries worked in the local language, attempting to bring Christianity and its benefits in Chinese dress. And that was Calvin Wilson Mateer. Not all missionaries you can be proud of, just like not all pastors or parishioners you can be proud of. But Calvin Mateer was phenomenal. He came as an evangelist, traveling all around, wanted to evangelize villages, and while he was traveling around, his wife stayed home in an abandoned Buddhist temple. It was sort of a downturn of Buddhism in Shandong province at the time, so they were living in an abandoned Buddhist temple. Well, she's sitting at home, they have no kids, so she finds these orphan kids running around, and she brings them in and starts learning Chinese and then teaching science and math and philosophy to these young orphan boys. Sets up a school which, fast forward 20 years later, becomes the first university in China. And it was really started not by Calvin, but by Julia, as she was sitting home alone while her husband was out trying to make a name for himself. He came back and realized that she had a school and said, well, I guess we have a school. Let's focus on education. And he spent the next 40 years of his life working on the Chinese language. Basically, every missionary for about 70 years who went to China studied using Calvin and Julia Mateer's language guide and grammar. Other missionaries, though, that came built larger and larger institutions. This is second and third generation. They focused on institutions. As some pastors have, they had an edifice complex. They wanted to build things bigger and then kind of put their name on it. But they also were concerned more about the benefits of Western civilization for the country, and there's a good reason for that. I don't criticize them for that, because China, I believe, by the middle to the end of the 19th century, suffered more than any country in the world. I mean, the famines that hit, the floods that hit. I mean, the Yangtze River didn't just sort of like fan out. It completely moved 250 miles and flooded all of Shandong province, the whole peninsula, just wiping out millions of people. It did that twice. So the suffering was so great when they went to China. You can understand why they would say, hey, forget all the Christianization. We've got to save these people. They're dying, they're starving, they're being flooded, there's disease. And so about third generation missionaries came concerned about bringing the benefits of Western civilization. Now, my point here is theology does matter. You know, what do you think you're doing? What is your theology of mission? And what is your theology of the church? And what does it mean to really be sent by God? And what does it mean to be sent by an institution? And so the second and third generations were much less concerned about Christianity in the church. One of them was also a Presbyterian missionary. She was from West Virginia. She wrote a really good book about starving and about famine in China. Who was that? Pearl S. Buck. Yeah. And she was angry about missionaries by the time you get to the 1930s, the missionaries that were trying to plant churches. If we get rid of these preachers, we can get on and do the work that we should be doing in China. So there was that kind of a split that took place. But missionary work was uncomfortably tied to Western imperialism, the trade in opium, the English language, and Western education. Resistance to Western imperialism and missions was replaced, interestingly enough, after much violence, by a great appreciation for a European ideology called Marxism. It is interesting, isn't it? Both were Western influences in China. The ideology proved to be much more damaging than even the worst of Western imperialism. And Western imperialism was bad. Mao's Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution together, it's estimated, claimed over 40 million lives. The worst suffering of a people directly caused by political policy in known history. That's huge. The church was given a choice: fall in line, with the revolution here, or be sent off to prison, re-education camps, or for many, die. I've met pastors with PhDs and MDivs who spent 10 of their prime years of their life in their 30s or 40s digging up onions, harvesting mushrooms, or cow manure. They are gentle and understated giants of the faith. As outsiders, we completely misread the events and the meaning of Christianity in Mao's China. We misread it two ways. Conservatives and fundamentalists were anti-communist all the way. They believed that we must disobey the communist rulers and smuggle in Bibles. They thought, maybe many of us here today have given money to send Bibles into China. I did. They thought the church would not survive if we did not prop it up. It was necessary for us to prop up the church. They will die if we don't help them. You know, it's necessary for the West to make Christianity survive. We know now that what happened to Christians is that they were sent off to farms and prisons, and most of those people remained faithful. So what happened was when they were sent off, it spread Christianity. So Mao, intending to wipe it out, scattered the seed. I've held one of those, as they spread the faith, they copied the Bibles in their own hand. It's a remarkable history, actually. I've held one of those hand-copied Bibles, and I just about trembled. I felt too dirty to hold it when I think of the suffering that had to happen. And I heard the testimony of how it was copied, how they would copy it, you know, at night and have to cover the windows so nobody knew they were doing it. And they would sneak off the next night and take it to the next village after they copied, you know, one of the books, and they sewed it together. So it wasn't really necessary for us to prop up the church. Conservatives underestimated the power of the gospel and the Christian resolve of the Chinese. So again, theology does matter. They had a theology of the value of the word and their willingness to suffer and risk their lives for it. Liberals were no better in their response. They hailed Mao as the new Moses, leading God's people to the promised land of equality and justice. The following is from a forthcoming book on missiology, written by the man I shaved this morning. Thank you. In 1972, it takes a little while, you know. Lunch, the blood all goes down to the stomach. In 1972, an article was published in the International Review of Mission that discussed salvation in purely secular terms as liberation brought by the savior figure Mao Zedong. As the author expressed, he was a Canadian, if we look at salvation in this world, we can see the work of Mao was a work of bringing salvation to China. The process is not complete and it's not perfect, but the parallels with Jesus open up new understandings of what salvation today really means. What such an article shows us is that in a search to identify the movement of God, which is a very dangerous thing to do in the world, and then participate in that movement as we identify it, it is often difficult to discern the genuine works of God. Ideologies often creep in looking like the work of God. One person's liberator is another person's oppressor. Mao the liberator became one of the most tragic rulers in human history. Our point is not how violent Mao was, but how difficult and even misleading it is for the church to try to make these large prophetic statements interpreting world events. We usually get it wrong. Now I'm quoting not from myself, but from Lamin Sane from Yale. C.S. Song, the great Asian theologian and Presbyterian minister, said Mao's Long March was the inauguration of a new stage in the history of salvation. China was the new Israel, he contended, on the tacit grounds perhaps that old Israel, in terms of old China, was now defunct. Salvation history, he declared, has to do with God's acts in history, and thanks to the changes wrought by the Chinese Communist Party, that was being acted out in a transition from the old China to the new China. There was great hope and excitement from many people who were imbibing of a type of liberation theology. Now, there are other types of liberation theology I have great respect for. This is from Lutherans and Catholics who came up with a statement in 1974. Now, you should have known better by then, because you've gone through the Great Leap Forward. You're towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. But listen to this. The liberation movement in China led by Mao Zedong is not excluded, therefore, from our understanding of God's saving work in history. The Christian can affirm the gains of the Chinese Revolution insofar as these have contributed to the humanization process, while at the same time recognizing that liberation in China is not complete or final. In China, to an impressive degree, the basic human needs have been met, dignity has been restored, people have been freed to participate in the decision-making process that affects their daily lives. I'm sorry, I can't go on. I've met some of those people who suffered under that, who lost hands, who lost relatives under that. And to have the audacity to identify that as a great work of liberation of God. The communique, I believe, is an abandonment of those Christians who are suffering for the gospel. Today, this liberal response to Mao and China, a response driven by an ideology of liberation, is just revealed as bad theology and an abandonment of basic Christian understanding. Mission is about Jesus and the renovation of individuals and societies through Christ, not instead of Christ. What Mao really brought about was human tragedy, not human liberation, because all ideologies tend towards idolatry, and all idolatry tends towards violence. Let me repeat that. I believe all ideologies tend towards idolatry, and all idolatry tends towards violence. What about today in China? Well, Christianity is growing at all levels. Roman Catholic, in-house churches, Protestant. My experience is mostly with the China Christian Council and the Three Self-Patriotic movement. Seminaries are growing anywhere you look at it, and it's not just Chinese in China. Chinese around the world are coming to faith. A friend of mine who was a professor, the first professor to return to Beijing to teach religion in China after Mao. She has a PhD from Harvard in history of religions, and so she was the first person to begin to develop modern words for the study of comparative religions. She had a student who was not a Christian, well, not a baptized Christian, was probably what we call a culture Christian, who did a master's thesis on culture Christians in Beijing. And the reason I'm pretty sure she was a culture Christian is there's no way she would have had access to all of these basically house churches throughout Beijing. She identified between 40 and 50,000 people in Beijing alone involved in these unregistered house meetings, all intellectuals, all upper-class people. These are people who have all been to university, their minds have been opened up, they started studying religion, they're reading the Bible. Now, what do they do in these houses? They meet once a week, they gather around and have a meal together, they pray, they open the Bible and read usually words of Jesus and then talk about what it means to follow them. But they're not Christians. I wish my church members would do that. But these are not Christians because if they were to be baptized, most of them would lose their jobs. I have a friend who's a professor in Shanghai University, which was a Marxist university built under Mao. This was not one of the earlier former Christian universities. And you know, I'm assuming he's a culture Christian, but he's become a party member. And I asked him why he's become a party member. He says, well, I have no influence. I can't sit on committees and make decisions unless I become a party member. And yet his sympathy for Christianity, his sensitivity is just so clear that he's a Christian. So this is one thing that's happening throughout China. Intellectuals. Now the Pandora's box of knowledge has been opened up, and they are just hungry for it. They're excited about it, and so they're coming to faith. But they have a hard time going to the regular churches because most of the churches, most of Christianity in China is peasant Christianity. It's mostly people with maybe an elementary school education. They're all literate. Most everybody in China is literate, but they're not intellectuals. Secondly, all churches in China are huge and overflowing. If you see pictures of, oh, you know, there's President so-and-so in China, wow, look, it's a full service. Well, it's true everywhere in China. Every church is just exploding. They can't get enough. But the problem is you can't build a new church building unless you have an ordained pastor who's attended an official seminary. But the official seminaries, there's only 21 for a country of 1.3 billion people and maybe 70 to 100 million Christians. And so there's no way they can get enough people trained. And so churches just kind of explode and they meet. They're meeting in theaters. Our other daughter attended a church in Xiamen, which is a beautiful tropical island in South China. She was studying there for a year. And she attended an unregistered church. Police would go by, military would go by. Everybody knew it was a church. But they couldn't get a building. They didn't have anybody who'd been to seminary. And so they just met there. So all churches in China are just filled to overflowing. Thirdly, the government since 1982 has been reopening churches, building churches, promoting the publication of the Bible in China. And we need to remember that. They now have almost saturated the market because they're printing Bibles in Spanish and Portuguese and Thai to export them because they have this state-of-the-art printing press in Nanjing that is just phenomenal. And there's a second press also in Beijing. So they're producing Bibles all over the world. I just downloaded an article today that announced over 80 million Bibles have been printed and distributed in China since 1988. That has never happened in the history of the world. 80 million printed and distributed since 1988. China's printing Bibles for the whole world and exporting them. If somebody says, we need to smuggle Bibles into China, say, no, don't do that. Just go to China and you can buy one for $1 and then give it to people. And I can give you 10, 15 places you can go. Yeah, so it's too expensive to have them printed elsewhere and brought in. And it's a good Bible. It's not a communist Bible or anything like that. It's, you know, people are becoming Christians reading it, so how communist can that be? Fourthly, non-registered churches proliferate and often cooperate with registered churches. This is another myth that we often have, is that there's this great division between the unregistered and registered churches. Depending upon where you go, quite often a local pastor of a registered church will be preaching in a non-registered church, in a theater or in a factory or in somebody's home. And quite often non-registered church people will take some courses or go to a university where there are Christian professors. One university where there's a number of Christian professors is Fudan. As a matter of fact, we have a professor who's going to be speaking here at a conference in September. If he's not a Christian, he's certainly doing a lot more good for the church than most of us are, because he's teaching courses. He went to Princeton University, and he's training pastors, you know, through Fudan University, teaching evening courses. I know it all sounds very confusing, and it is. But my point is, there's no clear distinction between registered and unregistered churches. They really do overlap. Now, where there's a clear distinction is right when you're in the heart of the government, in Beijing. You know, that's one of the hardest places. And the second place where there'd be more division would be in Nanjing. That was the former southern capital, Nanjing, and Beijing is the northern capital. Fifthly, Chinese Christianity may seem to be very conservative, but that's just looking at it with our Western eyes. It's really very spiritual, very close to the Bible, and it's just Confucianist. Okay, that influence of Confucianism has the impact of making it look more conservative. But yes, it is conservative in the fact that they are living very close to the Bible in all that they do. But in terms of some of their social concerns and morality and so forth, it really, what it's done is got inside Confucianism and kind of lifted it up and cleaned it off and giving it a reason for this kind of social order. Because Confucianism is a social order, and so most of the Chinese, we would talk about as being conservative or something, but actually I think it's the way it's been enculturated in China. I'm going to pick up on Jeffrey now. 4 years later, after Caroline was now a seminary student, our daughter was our translator on a trip to China. That was a wonderful time. And just two quick stories about that. When we were in Nanjing at the headquarters of the China Christian Council, our daughter was sitting up on the side, and we had our delegation here. We had all these dignitaries, and we're sitting around. And since I was leading the group, I was sitting up front, you know, next to the chairman of the China Christian Council. And this man came in from the back and sat next to our daughter, and she leaned over and spoke to him in Chinese and explained that we're a delegation from Pittsburgh, the best seminary in North America, and so forth, and what we were doing. And or maybe second best, I'm not sure. Thank you, CF. And so, so he immediately stood up and said, "Excuse me, I just want to say," and he said this in Chinese, and she translated for him, "This is the most wonderful thing. Here in China, we have a woman from the West who dresses respectfully because she knows how to dress in Asia. You don't wear short skirts and shorts and T-shirts and tank tops." And so she had lived in China for 2 years. She was fairly fluent Chinese. She speaks our language and she dresses better. Many of the young ladies out here in our streets of our city don't know how to show respect, you know. So all of a sudden, we could have asked for anything, and we could have got it at that point. The value of learning the language, the value of understanding culture, and seeing the gospel penetrate within cultural clothes is just overwhelming. I don't speak Chinese, so I feel this big. After Nanjing, we went to Beijing, and Jeffrey just happened to be passing through, getting on a train. So he met us at the hotel where we were staying, and he had a box of Bibles. Jeffrey had become a Christian. And so we talked about what happened. Well, Caroline had this thing when she was teaching where she was teaching English, and if a student did real well, they got a good grade on the exam, and she made sure that everybody at some point got a good grade on the exam. They were invited into her flat, her apartment, for a real American lunch. So she would make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and potato chips, you know. This is what they eat in America. Oh, very interesting. Okay. And then on the coffee table, she had her dad's book, The Dictionary of Asian Christianity. And she had Bible verses on the wall and some pictures of her family who were involved in ministry and this sort of thing. So they would ask, well, what's this? And then she showed the article on China in the Dictionary of Asian Christianity. They would see that, oh, there's Christianity in China, you see. So Jeffrey had a little bit of exposure. It's not legal to evangelize, but it's certainly not illegal to answer questions. And so they would ask questions like, well, teacher, what do you do on Sunday? Well, there you go. And so Jeffrey had another English teacher who was also a Christian, so he came to faith a year earlier. So why is he getting on a train with a box of Bibles, this one-year-old Christian? He has become a part of this massive movement, the Back to Jerusalem movement. Some of you have heard of this before. It's unbelievable. I thought it was more myth than reality. You can find it on the internet. There's a more commercial website. But it is true. I have run into Chinese in Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, and I have a friend, believe it or not, in Egypt who ran into 2 Chinese who have all been a part of the Back to Jerusalem movement. Now, you might say, wait, back to Jerusalem. What are they doing in Egypt? If you know your geography, that's funny. They view the Middle East as Jerusalem. And since 1920s, when there was a vision from a pastor in Shandong province, part of the Jesus family, which is an indigenous Christian movement, there has been this understanding that the Chinese have an obligation to bring Christianity back to the Middle East, because that's where they first got it from. They first received it from Persia, which they identify as the Middle East. Therefore, now it's their responsibility, since they have forgotten about it, to take the gospel back. Chinese are very involved in the Back to Jerusalem movement. Now, I don't know what you think about it, but I'm just telling you it's a fact, and it is really big. So they were thanking God when the Chinese government put in this 4-lane highway going from Beijing all the way across to Turkmenistan, because they see this as an answer to prayer. Now, the Chinese need that road to bring all the oil from Central Asia to China, because China, if you listen real carefully, you go to China, this is what you hear. Just sucking oil out of the earth, okay? And they're going everywhere. They're all over in Africa. They're all over the Middle East. They're now in Latin America. They are looking for oil. And so they have built this road to help people like Jeffrey take Bibles, you know, across the Middle East. Chinese are coming to faith all over the world. And with the terrible history and the natural disasters, the terrible history of opium trade, the Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, one of the largest numbers of people killed in an internal civil war in the history of mankind, which was the Taiping Rebellion in the 1860s, still Christianity is thriving as never before, and I would suggest that you pay attention. Before maybe we move on, maybe I should take 1 or 2 questions, and then I'm going to go to Vietnam. Yes?
When you talk about the government supporting the sale of Bibles and registered churches, is that, for me to understand, is that because they recognize that it contributes to social order then?
Yeah, the government is not against the Bible. And I think one of the reasons is they've studied history and says, well, the Bible is a good civilizing thing. You know, even Mahatma Gandhi realized that. You know, his protesters were reading the words of Jesus, basically the Sermon on the Mount. And so it's going to teach good ethics, good morality. The government is no longer against all religion. It sees the value in religion. It's just trying to control it. Certain religious practices are damaging. Okay, there are certain movements, especially Buddhist sects, and they're aware of the Taiping Rebellion, which was a Christian-influenced rebellion in the 19th century. And yet they realize we can't stamp out religion, so let's use it.
So my second part of the question was, that sounds an awful lot like Constantine.
Yes and no. It's interesting. Constantine did not make Christianity the legal religion, the religion of the empire. He just made it legal. We need to be careful about that. It was another 40, 50 years before it became the state religion, so there's a lot of in between. So this is more like Constantine in allowing the faith, yes. But it's not like Constantine in setting aside a day for worship for the whole empire that's going to follow Christianity and that sort of thing. But it's a whole different experience in China today. Anything else? Should we move on to Vietnam? In 1979, my wife and I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, and in our little small group through a Presbyterian church, we became frustrated because we said all we're doing is we're sitting around studying the Bible, and what difference does that make? And so it was Christmas time, and we had been studying as Advent the identity of the Messiah, the coming Messiah. And this is why I suggest not reading the Bible unless you're willing to let your life be changed. Because as we studied the identity of the Messiah, we saw the Messiah was identified as what? One who'd suffered and bore the sorrows of other people. The Messiah is one who's pretty powerful. And we realized, we don't even know people in prison. We don't even know people who are suffering. We're all like graduate students, and one was a doctor, one was an accountant. And we're just sitting here, reading the Bible every week, trying to be nice people. And we realized our Christianity was more like therapy than it was really about living on the edge of life. And so sitting on our coffee table were two things. That same daughter, Caroline, who was just a couple months old, and she was in on little seats, and this magazine that said, needed sponsors for Vietnamese refugees. This was the second wave of refugees coming. 24-hour hotline. So I said, hey, why don't we do something radical? Why don't we, 20-somethings, I was 23 at the time, okay? Why don't we do something radical? Let's call and see if we can do this. And so I picked up the phone and called and said, I said, yes, can I help you? I said, well, I see you have this need for sponsors for Vietnamese refugees. Can you tell me a little bit about it? And she said, well, what size family would you like? I said, what size family would we like? And we decided we would kind of narrow it. It had to be 5 or less, okay? Because we lived in a 3-bedroom flat, and we had one room for the baby, so we could put like 5 Vietnamese in the other room or something. And so we said, well, do you have something like 5 or less? Yes. Would you like a husband and wife and children, or a widow and children? What do we want? Do we want a husband and wife? Do we want a father and mother? What do we, uncles and aunts? And so we decided, since I traveled some, since my wife would be home, we'd go with the widow and children thing. So do you have something with like a widow and children? Sure, we have a widow and 4 children. Within 5 minutes, we changed, our whole lives were changed. I said, we'll send you information, and 2 weeks later, they flew from Malaysia, landed in Richmond, Virginia, and I drove with a Vietnamese engineering student. And we went to the airport. I'll never forget it. And there they were, each with their little plastic bag. And stupid me, I said, well, let's go to baggage claim. That's it. So we got in the car and tried to get to know each other through translator, and John, our translator, immediately took them up to the bathroom and showed them you do not stand on the toilet because they're used to squat pots, okay? And we went in the kitchen and showed about how to cook and how to turn off the stove and oven and everything. They were frightened to death. That first night, we were going to give them 2 bedrooms. There's no way they would sleep apart from each other. So Hong, Nhan, and Lin slept on the floor in the spare room, and our little baby daughter had this whole room to herself. About 2 in the morning, she started crying. Before I got out of bed, you know what I'm going to say. Hung was in there, rocking Caroline, taking care of her. Our lives were changed. We began to study Asia. And we realized the needs in Asia were so great. We were thinking of going to Latin America until that point. God just took our hearts, ripped them out, and moved us a whole different direction as we realized the tremendous suffering in Asia. Later on, we got to Singapore and visited the refugee camp in Malaysia. There were still some refugees there, had nobody sponsoring them. They had developed a life of 15 years just living in this refugee camp. It really was overwhelming. I realized how insulated we were. But that's why I gave you that verse to start off with. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. What would Christ want you to do in a situation like that? We were really bad at it. We made lots of mistakes. We weren't prepared. What did we know? 22, 23 years old. The oldest was 25. They lived in our house for a year. And then Hung's sister-in-law, her husband also died. And so his sister-in-law was in Atlanta. She was being beaten by the man in the house there. She wanted out, so he said, well, come on up here. So she had 2 kids. So now we've got 2 widows and 6 kids. And it was hard. If we fast forward about 10 years later, we're coming back from Singapore, and they had migrated to California. And so we stopped off and visited them in Sacramento. And Hung was so excited. She worked at the Red Lion Inn as a chef. She's a great chef. And so she's going all around the hotel, you know, the manager, the assistant manager, the manager of the, you know, this is my sponsor, this is my sponsor, you know, this is my sponsor. I couldn't believe it. So we went back to the house. She had a cake. Thank you, sponsor. And then Lynn, who was the one who was really good at English, and she's a CPA, her mom said, get a job with the government. There are better benefits. So she's working with the government as a CPA. She said, Scott, she always called me Scott. I thought it was a little irreverent. Scott, Mom wants to know why you did it. You know, I'm looking around. What did I do? I spilled something, you know? Why did what? Why you sponsored us? I said, well, Lynn, let me tell you. I never would have done something like this. I know what I was like in high school. It was all about me. Captain of the soccer team, captain of the basketball team, president of the senior class. It was all about me. I was building my own kingdom. But when we found out about Jesus, our lives were changed. And when we heard this need, we just felt like we had to respond. We didn't know who you were. We didn't know what we could do, but we felt that this is the kind of thing that God would want us to do. And so, you know, we gave the testimony there and so forth. Now, I tell you that story because the globalization of the faith and also the liminal spaces of people going back and forth, the movements of people, is where Christianity explodes. It's not in the suburbs where everybody's exactly alike. It's at places of conflict. It's at places of movement. It's at places of migration. It's at transitions in life. It's at funerals. It's at weddings. And the grace of God just explodes in places like that. And it changed our lives. And that's why I'm here today. A second story. In about 1990, I was in the principal's office at Trinity Theological College in Singapore, and another guest was coming by. Singapore is the crossroads of Southeast Asia, and we had guests all the time. Couldn't get much work done. And so the principal invited me in and wanted to introduce me to this man who was an American. Well, I looked at him, and he looked like a Vietnamese. Well, he was a Vietnamese who had become an American. He was a refugee. And so Quang Nguyen told us his story, how he'd been a pastor of a very large Protestant church in Ho Chi Minh City, and after the end of the war, he remained in Vietnam to care for his parishioners, even though the communists had moved in, and he knew pastors were going to be, they were going to after pastors, because this kind of communism is strongly anti-Christian, anti-religious. So he was quickly arrested and put in prison. What did he do in prison? What would you do in prison? He didn't have a Bible, so he recited out loud every verse he could remember as the deer pants for flowing streams, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul longs for God, for the living God. When shall I behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night. And he went on and on. He recited every verse he could remember. And then he sang songs, any song he could remember, to remember who he was. He didn't know that in remembering who he was, he would help other people find out who they are. Pastor, pray for me. He was in solitary confinement. Who's that? My name is Nyak. Yes, Nyak, I will pray for you. What should I pray for? Well, after a while, the whole cell block was Christian. And they were furious. He'd started a cell group ministry. Yes, you knew it was coming. And so they moved him to another cell block. Okay? Well, that happened 3 times. And then they kicked him out of the country. They literally took him across the border into Cambodia and dumped him. What are you going to do with a Christian like that? You know? So the faith just spread. The persecution spread the faith. Does that sound familiar? So there he was, exiled. He ended up in California. He was one of those refugees that some good Christian family took him in, built him up, and he said, Christianity is growing in Vietnam. I'm hearing the words that it's growing even under the communists. We need to prepare more pastors. So he started a college called the Vietnamese Theological College to train Vietnamese pastors in California who'd be able to return to Vietnam. Now, think about this. That's the country that persecuted you. That's the country that put you in prison. And what do you want to do? Go back? I have been crucified with Christ. The following is from a 2001 posting on the PCUSA website, the PCUSA News. Quote, the Vietnamese Theological College, also known as Union College of California, is the only state-approved Vietnamese language theological school in the world. Since its founding in 1986, more than 1,000 students have been trained to become church leaders in Vietnamese Protestant communities around the world, and increasingly in recent years in Vietnam. In 1991, VTC began expanding its operation, establishing satellite campuses in Europe and Australia. In 1993, it began a modest and very quiet theological studies program in Vietnam, a predominantly Buddhist and Catholic country where Protestants are deeply distrusted by the government because of their history of aggressive evangelism. Thank you, PCUSA website. VTC's long-term goal is to train 10,000 pastors between now and 2020. It's over a 30-year period. And of course, we hope to have a seminary in Vietnam within the next 10 years, he said. Union University of California is what it's called now. You can check their website. Not now, please. I have to tell my students that. Please don't do that, okay? Is now moving to become one of the first completely online theological schools for training people in Vietnamese, Chinese, and in the future, Malay. The new president is a former PCUSA pastor from Washington State. A month ago, he came right here to Pittsburgh Seminary and asked me if I would help be as an advisor for academic standards for theological education. Christianity is growing very rapidly in Vietnam. And a graduate of Pittsburgh Seminary. Thank you, Mr. President. And yes, he really is the president, okay? About 8 million people in Vietnam are Roman Catholics, and the church is growing rapidly. That's about 10%. And by the way, once a country becomes 2 to 3%, statistically 2 to 3% Christian, it can completely evangelize itself, its own region, its country. Less than that, it's very hard. There's always need for outside support and so forth. Protestants did not come until very late, not until 1911. One of the last places in Asia, in the world, where missionaries came was in Vietnam. Protestant missionaries came was Vietnam. Today, most of the missionary work is carried on by Asians from Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, thank you, Korea, Malaysia, and Singapore. But, as anyone in Vietnam will tell you, the real growth is happening by Vietnamese witnessing to their own faith. The Protestant churches are growing very rapidly with little coordination or cooperation. There is some. There's an international group that meets in the United States twice a year to help coordinate so that everybody's, we don't want to create some of the same problems we did in the past by creating rice Vietnamese Christians and that sort of thing. So what does it mean to properly support and encourage the church? It's impossible to accurately measure the size of the Protestant church, but it's likely to be now about 2%, growing at a rate of 2.6% a year. The population in Vietnam is growing 1.1%. It doesn't take long, even if you're not a math major like me, to figure out this is really big. It's growing over twice, about 2.5 times the rate of the general population. But the church continues to be persecuted. I'm going to tell one final story, and then we'll have time for a few questions. Local Asian Christians in Southeast Asia are creatively supporting and building Christian communities in Vietnam. A Singaporean businessman, a seminary graduate from Trinity, where I taught, is making very high-end, expensive tiles for wealthy Vietnamese. It is one of the leading companies in Ho Chi Minh City. He has this massive factory with hundreds of people working there. I've been to his storefront, what do you call it here? His retail outlet. Thank you very much. You get an A. Oh, we're not graded in this. You would have gotten an A, okay, if you just signed up for the course. So at his retail outlet, it's a beautiful place, 5-story building. It's unbelievable. You walk in and there are fountains coming down and all these fancy tiles. He has 2 full-time artists designing new kinds of designs. And I have a tile that I bought called Bun-Dang, which means peace. And so he's designed some with characteristics that make it possible to begin to talk about, what does it mean to have real peace? He's a fascinating guy. He's a Singaporean seminary graduate turned businessman who set up a factory where he's able to hire his own people and have Bible studies in the factory. And then he prays for the laborers, for their families, and helps them out if they're struggling, visits them in the hospital. So it's very interesting. A final quick story. One of my students in Trinity in Singapore, when I started an Asian church history class, he missed the first class. Now, a Chinese just won't miss a class unless they're dying. So the second class, I said, David, where were you? He says, oh, sorry, very sorry. I was in Vietnam setting up a fish farm. You're in Vietnam setting up a fish farm? Oh, yes, it's my mission, sir. I'm sorry. It's your mission? Well, his mission was to set up this massive area of fish farming to raise the level of protein in people's diets. And at the same time, he hired people, have the same, a lot of these Asians have this idea, same idea, that at 6 o'clock in the morning they meet out in groups around the fish farms before they do the feeding and harvesting and everything. And they have a little Bible study, a little prayer, and then they go to work. Now, most of them are Buddhists, but they find it helpful. They pray for the family. And so he was kind of showing them what they should do in their morning meetings. So this kind of creativity in ministry in Asia is really quite overwhelming, and it helps to explain why there is such a movement in all of Asia, and the continent which has been the most resistant to the gospel. We have about 2 or 3 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, I meant to leave more time, and we never got to East Malaysia. But yes, sir. Yeah, I will not make any predictions. Phyllis will, but I won't. It's just really hard to know. Remember Lebanon. Lebanon used to be about 75% Christian. And now most any Middle Eastern restaurant around here is Lebanese Christians, okay, because they've just fled. The same thing is happening in Syria. The same thing is happening in Egypt. And yet, when I was in Egypt 2 years ago, I ran into this Egyptian guy that just came from a conference on Egyptian missionaries working in the Mideast. So Egyptian Christians are going to Saudi Arabia. They can move around the Mideast real easily. And so they're doing missionary work in Sudan. I ran into some Egyptians doing missionary work, medical work, rehabbing homes in Sudan. I mean, that's northern Sudan, the Muslim Sudan, not southern Sudan. So there is this kind of thing going on, and it's remarkable. We have a graduate from here who's going to a North African or Middle Eastern country to work in slums. Servant Partners, I don't know if you know much about Servant Partners, check their website. This is high-octane Christianity. They're going to go move into a slum, pretty much live at that level, trying to take care to eat well and stay healthy, to begin to listen to the people in the slum. What are the needs? How can we move out of this dire condition to develop better education, better nutrition, better social order, but moving in a complete identification with Muslims in the Middle East. So there are a lot of creative things like that happening, but you're right. The liberation that came with the Arab Spring is not turning out the way many people wanted it to turn out. Yeah. Yes? Oh, absolutely. All over East Asia. You cannot believe, once Christians are able to gather and come together, they immediately are moving into these needs. In 3 weeks at Fuller Seminary, I'm going to be a part of a group where they have 21 people who are going to be teaching pastoral ministry at the 21 seminaries in China. Well, it'll be 25. There'll be some government officials there too. And they're going to be talking about this very thing, taking care of the elderly, taking care of the mentally handicapped, taking care of this thing. How do you teach pastoral care in China today? And it's going to be sort of a dialogue. The School of Psychology has been working on this for 10 years in California. But I have seen, Bill Carl has been with me as we've visited some of these places where it's just remarkable. Churches where they use the whole basement as a place for elderly to live, because many of the young people, if you only have one kid and they've got to work, they go to the city to work. You no longer have the farm with 5 or 6 kids to take care of mom and dad. And so these elderly people are being abandoned. And so the churches are struggling to fill that gap. Yeah, it's a very good question.